Okay, everybody, welcome to this seminar, and also welcome to people joining us online. It's our first talk of the year, really, I suppose. But anyway, without further ado, let me introduce you to Tanja and Aatu, who'll be gently leading us by the hand into the 18th century. We'll usually be working in the 17th at the moment, but over to you, talking about sociocultural change and public discourse.
Right, so hello everybody and greetings from Helsinki. I'm an assistant professor in English language at the University of Helsinki, and this is my postdoc Aatu, who is also a linguist. And we are here because of the RiCEP project. So this is the Rise of Commercial Society and 18th Century Publishing. It's funded by the Research Council of Finland for 1 more year. And we've got lots of things going on. So we are combining intellectual history, book history, historical sociolinguistics, and computational and digital humanities approaches to study questions like how was sociocultural change and public discourse intertwined in 18th century Britain. We've got this commercial aspect, but we are also looking at other things, as you will see. And our materials include large-scale databases of historical texts. So we are combining full texts and metadata. The full texts are mainly from 18th Century Collections Online, or ECCO. And then we have the English Short Title Catalogue, or ESTC, for the metadata. And in Helsinki, we have a harmonized and augmented version of this, which makes it easier to kind of differentiate between different editions of works and differentiate between the different publishers and printers and authors and so on. Right, so this is our project team, or at least some of us in the picture. So my co-PI is Mikko Tolonen from history, and I am the linguist. Then we have 3 postdocs, Aatu from linguistics. Then we have Lydia Pivovarva, who does NLP and who has a computer science background. And then we have Jan Ryan, who is our history postdoc. And then we've got one doctoral researcher, Iiro Tiihonen, who is a historian, but he also has a background in mathematics. So we have these multidisciplinary people. And then a couple of research assistants. So Ruilin Wang, who actually just completed his master's, and Bo Feng, who has been working with us actually on the Scotticisms that we'll be talking about, but from a slightly different angle. And we've got lots of collaborators, but maybe most importantly, one of them is Tony McHenry, and that's why we're here. So kind of visiting our collaborator and talking about possibilities of collaboration. And for the linguists, maybe Douglas Fiber, Susan Fitzmaurice, Leslie Milroy will be familiar names. And then we've also got lots of people from history, book history, and more intellectual history. And then some kind of local data science, computer science people like Leo Lahti, Eetu Mäkelä, Jukka Suomela. So moving on to our first case. This is a large-scale analysis of the use of Scotticisms in the 18th century. And yeah, as I said, not everything is to do with commercial society necessarily. So in the 18th century, the standardization of the English language in Scotland basically became a central topic in public discourse because of the Act of the Union and so on. So England and Scotland became the United Kingdom. And then this standardization was promoted by various groups. So there was the Select Society of Edinburgh, which flourished kind of mid-century. And one of the members of this society was the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, pictured here. And yeah, he had this glossary that was kind of without explanation appended to his political discourses in 1752. And there he listed Scotch words and phrases that should be avoided, kind of stigmatized, and then the preferred English equivalents. So for example, he had the Scotch to be difficulted, which should be in proper English, to be puzzled. And this list was reprinted a number of times in the 18th century, so this suggests that it was seen as important, that it might have influenced at least some 18th century writers. And here's a screenshot of like one of these reprints. I think this was the Scots magazine in the 1760s. So what we want to do is look at the actual use of the items on this list. So how common was the use of Hume's Scotticisms in 18th century British books? Who used them and where? So we're looking at authors, their regional backgrounds, so Scottish versus English, the publisher, the place of publication, so basically at the level of Scotland versus England, genre, and so on. And then we want to know if there was change over time. So was there actually standardization? Did efforts like Hume's make a difference? So material, as I mentioned, 18th Century Collections Online. This is obviously a massive resource, so there are 200,000 volumes and it covers half of the surviving printed record of 18th century Britain. But there are lots of challenges as well. So there are people who have tried to use this for linguistic research before and they've given up because basically it's so messy. The texts are not clean, they have been scanned in and digitized, and then there has been this process of optical character recognition, which in some cases has made rather a mess of the texts. So some of them are not even kind of human readable, but many of them are to kind of some extent. And some of them are mostly perfectly. And then there are, of course, biases in the composition of the collection, and some of them are like historical. So obviously the volume of printing increased throughout the centuries, so we've got the most data from the end. But then, of course, there's also the thing that, well, the company that owns this resource, basically Yale, says that they have chosen the kind of most significant works to be included in ECCO, and then like who is to say what are the most significant ones? And there are these biases of some people, we've got lots of editions of the same work, and then others we might not have at all. And then we have metadata from the English short title catalogue, as mentioned, and this has been harmonized by the Helsinki Computational History Group. And for this study, we've restricted the dataset to first editions of book-length works, and this comes to about 18,252 books. And then we have some additional author and genre metadata produced at COMHIS as well. So we have some data on the background, so whether the author was Scottish or English. And this is kind of not perfect, not complete, but we do have a pretty good list of Scottish authors, basically. And then we have automatically produced genre metadata, which is more or less reliable, more reliable for some genres than others. Then methods, how did we actually find these Scotticisms? We retrieved a plain text version of Hume's list from the Lexicons of Early Modern English, which is a resource that kind of includes all of these glossaries. And then we operationalized it by doing textual lookups using regular expressions. So for example, Hume has a Scotticism, cause him do it. But of course, cause, the verb can be inflected in various ways. There can be OCR errors, so it was written with a long S, so then sometimes it read as an F. Then him, maybe this could be another personal pronoun, so we list all of the different personal pronouns and so on. And then we omit it because we don't think that's needed for this. But then we have to, of course, this doesn't find other verbs than do. So I think that the idea is that this cause him verb something, and then the proper English version is cause him to verb something, or cause somebody to verb something. Yeah, so we still don't find everything, but we find quite a bit. But many of the items would need some sort of a structural or part of speech analysis to kind of identify them correctly or identify them more correctly. So here, if we had the post-hoc version, we could look for the verbs. And then also semantic disambiguation, because a lot of these are like, you are using the word in the wrong sense, you should use a different word. So for example, well, I think the chimney example is a good one. So apparently Scots use chimney to mean grate. They should rather than smokestack. So they shouldn't be using chimney. They should be using grate. Okay. But altogether, we were able to analyze 67 Scotticisms and 58 of the counterpart Englishisms out of these pairs. There were actually 106 in total on Hume's list. So a pretty nice selection. And here are some of the items included. Sorry, this is quite small, but I'll just give some examples. So conform to should be conform to in English. Maltreat should be abuse. So that's more like a semantic thing. Incarcerate should be imprison. I don't know why. Fresh weather should be open weather. Notwithstanding of that should be notwithstanding that. There are quite a few of these where there's like Hume says it's the wrong preposition. So in the long run should be at long run. But I think it's in the long run in standard English now. So I don't know what he's going on about. Yeah, and there's some of these alenarly, solely, adverb type things. Here's the cause him do it, cause him to do it. Marry upon, married to. So there's some sort of preposition again. And on the following page, yeah, these are slightly interesting. So different spellings of ancient authors. And then there are these word order things like butter and bread should be bread and butter. Okay. Pepper and vinegar and pepper. That kind of thing. So quite a mixed bag, and they are not in any sort of order. So apparently he was just collecting them as he kind of came across them. There's not even alphabetical order. A bit bothering, but there we are. So then methods of analysis. So for our first iteration, we did simple visualization, for example, box plots. And these are basically univariate. So we are looking at the relationship between Scotticisms and individual other variables of interest, like time or nationality or even OCR noise. These are easy to interpret, but they don't allow for more complex analysis, and maybe, yeah, they don't really prove anything yet, so we can't assess the significance. Whereas in the second iteration, we used penalized multivariate regression. So this is the work of Ira, who was the historian with a mathematical background. And this allows for the parallel consideration of hundreds of variables that could be related to the occurrence of Scotticisms. And it should also be robust against false signals due to this lasso penalization, which I don't know anything about. You can ask Ira if you want to. And then, well, it's both a pro and con. Interpreting this fitted model produces basically a more complex argument. Let's get into the analysis. So here we have a box plot of the frequency of Scotticisms in books by country of publication per decade of the 18th century. And blue is England, and no, red is England, and blue is Scotland. That makes no sense. We can see that in England, the frequency is quite low throughout, whereas in books published in Scotland, it's like the first half of the century, roughly. It's higher there, or the first 4 decades maybe, and then it goes down. So they're definitely, yeah, they are, Hume's Scotticisms are, broadly speaking, Scottish in the sense that they occur more in books published in Scotland, and there seems to be some sort of standardization going on as time goes on. So that's already a nice result. And then we can look at by author. So again, remembering our data is not full, but for the information that we have on Scottish authors versus non-Scottish authors, yeah, it is the Scottish authors who are using it more, and again in the first half of the century, basically, and then by the second half they're using it less, but still perhaps a bit more than non-Scottish authors. And then we can look at the Scottish authors by birth decade, and this is, again, we've got slightly less data here, but anyway, for the ones for which we know when they were born. And here it's a pretty clear division between those born in the 17th century versus those born in the 18th century. So the 17th century writers, or the ones who were born then but were writing in the 18th century, are using more Scotticisms. So that kind of makes sense. So it's somehow generational change. And then we can also look at OCR quality, which is our kind of factor that produces noise. So, but this basically shows that the better the quality, the more Scotticisms we find. So obviously, if the OCR is a mess, we don't find the words that we're looking for. But we're hoping that this doesn't really ruin our other results, because we think that the OCR is kind of, well, the noise is somewhat equally distributed, so it wouldn't affect our comparisons of Scottish versus English books. Right. So then we can look at selected genres. We don't really have enough data for some of them, but for history, law, and religion, maybe we can look at those. And history and religion behave like the corpus as a whole, basically. So the frequency is high at the beginning and goes down as time goes on. But then law, it's like super frequent throughout, which kind of makes sense. I mean, Scotland had its own legal system, and it retained it, even though there was the union. So they are still talking about law with these old Scottish terms. Right, and then we can look at the individual Scotticisms. Again, this is very small, but I'll take a few examples. And this is now like looking at the differences between genres and their frequencies overall. Let's look at law, which is blue. So we've got words like defunct. I don't know what that should be even. And then proven apparently should be proved. Proper English. That's in time coming. There's conform to. And there's stuff like in favors of, which should be in favor of an end. Yeah, stuff like that. And then we could also take a look at all of the other ones. Maybe religion, so that's dark brown. What do we have in religion? To open up. I'm not sure what that should be. Apparently they use that in religion, and also angry at, is that the one? Yeah, fairly frequent. Also in philosophy. Maybe that makes sense that they would talk about emotions, religion and philosophy. And then, yeah, that kind of thing. And then we can also compare these by publication country. So which ones are the most Scottish Scotticisms on Hume's list? And again, the most frequent ones and with the biggest difference at the top. So proven apparently is really common. Should be proved, an end to open up in favors of the proven, in time coming, and so on. These are the kind of obvious Scotticisms, but there are actually a few which are more common in books published in England. So maybe these are not, you just think that they are Scottish. They are not. And here we have in the long run, for example. So it's really not a Scotticism. And even pepper and vinegar, so some of these where it was the word order that was wrong to him. And even angry at, actually. It's English, or it's both. Right. Then we can look at top books using Scotticisms. And this is really like, this shows the dominance of legal texts. So there's lots of these stage of the process type of thing, which I think is like a legal process. And then we have essays upon several subjects in law. This is by Henry Home Lord Keynes, who was actually Hume's patron. And then we have the principles of bookkeeping. So maybe there's more like commercial, but also probably some legal stuff there as well. This is really where we find Hume's Scotticisms, which is interesting. So here's one example, and you can also see the OCR errors here. And it's not too bad here, but it's quite readable. And super plus is the Scotticism that it should be surplus, I think. So this is from Keynes's book. Because though the first two judges were preferable as to their 10,000 merks, and insofar as the annual rent to draw from them, the inhibitor was not prejudged, yet as to the superplus of 2,000 merks, the competition falling betwixt the inhibitor and the posterior annual renter, the inhibitor is entirely preferred. I don't know what he is talking about there, but yes, legal. Nothing about annual renters. Okay, moving on to the regression analysis. And for this one, we kind of filter the data down to, I think, only those books where we actually knew the author and whether they were Scottish or not, and so on. So then it went down to 8,500 observations. And then most of these were for the model fitting, and then some research for evaluation. Again, this was done by Ira, not by me. Predictors, there was a total of 651 predictors, but these are the most perhaps important ones. So OCR quality was like a continuous thing. I think it's given by Yale because they did the OCR, or they know that. Then there was the publication country by quarter century, so kind of looking at over time and for Scottish versus English books. Then the nationality of author by birth century, so kind of testing, is it really so that the ones born in the 17th century, the Scots born in the 17th century use it more. And then trying to look at publishers, so if there's a publisher with lots of data. And model details, for those who like those, it was a negative binomial model to handle over dispersion, phi equals 2. The target was the rate of Scotticisms in a volume, and the offset was the number of characters. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is like the normalization by number of characters. So we can't trust the number of words because of the OCR issues, and many words are like divided into multiple words. So what's more reliable as an indicator of document length is the number of characters, basically, and then we normalize by that. So what were the results? 16 variables with non-zero effect size, But basically, the most important ones associated with a higher rate of Scotticisms were Scotland as a publication place, as we saw in the pictures, and the effect decreases through the century. Law texts in terms of genre, Scottish authors born in the 17th century, as also seen. And then one publisher, we haven't really looked into this. Is this somehow spurious, or is there something to it? But Robert Dodsley seems to be associated with a lot of Scotticisms. And then with a lower rate of Scotticisms, yeah, obviously the low Oscar quality. But then this is like the maximally non-Scottish type of thing. So late 18th century scientific books published in England. So there you don't find these use of Scotticisms. And yeah, Scottish authors born in the 18th century. So definitely there is this division between both centuries. Now, Iiro wanted to say something about the reliability of the findings, so that the penalization should produce robust results. However, the analysis of residuals suggests that important variables might be omitted, and also the penalty can produce false negatives. So take the results with a grain of salt, but I mean, they look like they make sense. And they agree with the figures. But what about Hume himself then? Did he actually use any Scotticisms? And I think, yeah, we've done stuff where we looked at his own Scotticisms, the ones on his own list, and he only uses a few of them and not that much. But then there are later lists which kind of refer to Hume's and which try to make a more complete list and so on. So there was one by Sir John Sinclair, Observations of the Scottish Dialect, and there he had quite a few examples from Hume. So, for example, he had "you was" for "you were," and he says that this is an impropriety which even Mr. Hume was guilty of. So now we are testing, is that really true? So we looked at it in his publications, and for these we have clean data, so from the past masters collection, not OCR. And 0 instances of the non-standard form, 15 of the standard one. Okay. But in his letters, we find 41 instances of "you was." So Sinclair is right. Hume is using "you was," and only 17 instances of "you were." So yeah, uses some non-standard forms in public right. Another picture of Hume, this time wearing a turban, because why not? Okay, moving on to my discussion and beginning to hand over to Aatu. So summary of results. How common are these? Some of the items are quite common, like conform to, and as we saw, some of them are kind of more Scottish than others, and many of them are quite infrequent, like the bread and butter type of things. Why would you write about that in publications? Yeah, they are used more by Scottish authors and in books published in Scotland, and many of them are especially common in legal texts, as we saw. And there definitely is a decrease over time indicating standardization. So we found that the heaviest users were born in the 17th century. And the change seems to have been, looking at the pictures, maybe at its fastest around the mid-18th century or just before that. So maybe efforts like Hume's accelerated this ongoing standardization. They definitely didn't initiate it because it was already ongoing. Right, and why the focus on legal Scotticisms? Well, yeah, localized nature of legal language, but also Hume himself would have encountered a lot of these because he came from a family of lawyers. He was supposed to become a lawyer himself, but he was found ill-suited in some way. So maybe it's better that he became a philosopher. All his patrons were apparently lawyers, for example, Henry Home, from whom we saw the example. And he also would have been in contact with legal Scotticisms through his army position. He had a position as a diplomat, and then he even became a librarian at the Faculty of Advocates. He was basically editing and correcting. We're very close to his heart, and he was correcting his patrons and friends' writings, and also his own publications throughout his life. Right, so to conclude, Hume and the Select Society of Edinburgh seem to have contributed to an ongoing process of standardization. And yeah, as mentioned, Hume's glossary was not the only one of its kind produced at the time. Perhaps it was one of the first and one of the most influential that then inspired the rest, but this kind of reflects this ideology of standardization, that we should, yeah, to make the language better, we should get rid of variation. Yeah, and in future work, we would like to compare this actual usage with other lists of Scotticisms. So there's the list by Sir John Sinclair, but also by James Beattie, for example. And we are in the process of adding a purely data-driven approach to kind of compare Scottish versus English books. What kind of differences are there? And that's where our research assistant is doing his work. Right. So thanks for that. And now moving on to Aatu.
Yes, thank you, Tanja, for your part. This is something quite different, I would say, though also dealing with similar kinds of things in many ways. So still working with the 18th century, and I am looking here at the multidimensional analysis method and the influence of low quality OCR data on that. So I'm interested in questions of register. So as you may know, language is used differently in different situations for different purposes, and there are many different aspects of the situation which affect this, like the roles of participants, the relations, the setting, the topic, the attitude, the channel through which the language is being used, and also then the communicative goals of the writers or speakers, for example. And we can then measure these kind of situational concerns and these cognitive purposes, because these are of course reflected in the use of different linguistic features. And the idea here is that features are used in the kinds of situations and the kinds of purposes for which they are well suited. And well, here's the distinction between the register and the genre idea, and we're kind of using both here. So register is the functional aspect of language use. So what is the purpose behind this, or how does the situation affect this language? And then genre would be these conventional groupings like history writing or religious writing or law writing, for example, like we saw before. Multidimensional analysis is a method of looking at register variation developed by Douglas Piper originally in the 1980s, and this is a statistical analysis of a large number of linguistic features. So often the set of features used is the 67 features originally used by Piper, but more recent studies use larger sets of features, different sets of features. And yeah, like I said, the features which are well suited for similar situations and similar functions in language are assumed to tend to co-occur. And we can use factor analysis as a statistical method, or any other method as well, often factor analysis, to extract these co-occurring sets of features and also complementary sets of features. And we can then analyze these sets of features in terms of what is the reason that these things appear together in text and are absent together in text. Like, what is the text like? What is the function? What is the situation of the text when these things are present there? And we can interpret them as these functional dimensions of register variation. And in this sense, texts are located in a multidimensional register space, so to speak. So why use MBA in this kind of historical analysis, looking at, ECCO and things? And this is really a different approach to historical analysis, and in digital humanities, I think. Often traditional historical studies, even in DH, tend to focus more on the topic, so the content words of the things, but less on the function of the texts. What are the texts trying to do? What are their kind of constraints of the situation and the allowances of the situation? But here we are looking at the function. And also from the linguistic side, there are not that many MBA studies on historical language, and when there are any studies, those tend to use smaller manually edited datasets, like by Ben Finnegan 97, for example, which uses Archer, which is about 1,000 texts, which is a bit less than the 200,000 texts we have in ECCO, for example. But of course, the issue here is, and probably one reason why these big data sets haven't been used that much for MBA studies, is that MBA requires, of course, the identification, the automated identification of this large set of often quite complex linguistic constructions. And really the question is, what is the impact of the low quality OCR, often really bad OCR, on, well, this kind of data, this kind of analysis? For example, Gillian and Pension have looked at this and noticed that this low OCR quality really does affect many kinds of analysis in different ways. So yeah, the data set here is ECCO stale, and this is a lot of the same information you've already heard, but about the low OCR quality and such. But the important point here is the bottom one. So there is this ECCO OCR, like you call it, the main ECCO dataset, which is this dirty OCR dataset. But then we also have a small subset of the full ECCO, so-called ECCO TCP, which has been manually keyed. It's a version of ECCO. It's a much smaller version, but it is as clean as it can basically get reasonably. So maybe more or less equivalent to manually collected and curated corpora. Of course, maybe not as balanced, but still quite good in comparison to the ECCO OCR dataset. And we can use that as a comparison point here. And also, I think that there is a case to be made that MDA might actually work, might actually be usable for this kind of data. Because like McHenry and Hardy have said, for example, MDA studies have consistently produced these sets of register dimensions, which are not exactly the same, at least compatible with each other, meaning that they kind of they show and they demonstrate like similar distinctions and similar kinds of dimensions and ideas about language. And also Biber 2014 proposed these register universals, which are, in his view, these kinds of dimensions which tend to be discovered in almost all register studies. So, for example, the distinction between a more oral kind of discourse and a more kind of literate kind of discourse, and one between narrative versus non-narrative discourse. So if we can find these kinds of dimensions, even using different sets of features in many different studies, then maybe we might expect results even from this kind of dirty OCR imperfect data. Even if we can't find all the features that there are, we might still get some useful results out of it. So I guess there's nothing else to it but to actually try it and see what happens. And so how I did this MDA process then, this is pretty much the standard fare for this. So we use the ECCO OCR first, but I only took the subset which is equivalent to the ECCO TCP. So only this small part of the OCR data which is the same as what has been used for the clean ECCO TCP version to allow comparison then later. And we did part of speech tagging for that. And then I did identification of the features in these part of speech tagged texts based on the algorithms which have been provided by Biber. And I included most of these features. There were some which proved difficult to find using these automated means. And then some I had to change a little bit. And I, for example, split the first person pronouns into singular and plural because I found that those were quite differently from each other actually in many cases. But this is mostly based on Biber's set of features. Then, of course, normalization of the feature counts as usual, done to the character count of the text, like Tanja explained, and not to the word or token count, as it would be with a more common way to do it. And then the factor analysis, I ran that twice, first to prove out the features which turned out not to be very significant for the dataset, and then on the smaller set of features that was left over, I extracted 7 factors, then the usual assignment of the dimension scores to each text, so placing all of the text in those dimensions, and then interpreting these dimensions functionally. And since there are 7 of these, I'm just going to fly through these as fast as I am able to, which is not very fast, probably because I like talking about these things too much. But here is the first dimension I extracted. So very elegantly named past narrative literary versus non-past speech focus. And here we have, as you can see, the dimensions, the features which are associated with the positive and the negative end of this dimension on the left. And then we have these different genres which are based on that genre extraction methods that you mentioned at the beginning of ECCO and the positioning of these texts in these genres on this dimension. So, for example, this is called the past. We can see that here is the past tense and the present tense, which make the big distinction on this genre, on this dimension. And that is, of course, the past versus present. focus, but then we have other features like the agent-less passives, bipassives, which are maybe more kind of literary style, and then also prepositional phrases, more kind of informational style in that sense. And then, for example, discourse particles on the negative pole, and contractions, which are then more oral features. And here we can see that most of the genres are pretty high on this dimension. Of course, these are published literature, so they tend to be pretty maybe literate in that sense. But then, of course, for example, the arts genre, which contains mostly, I believe, plays and poems, which is an interesting combination. But those appear to be quite distinct from the others. They tend to use much more the present tense. So they are talking about, what the characters are doing, and the characters are speaking about, for example, in the present tense. Whereas in something like history tends to be a bit more maybe on the past side than the others. History is about past and narrating stories and what happened. Keep going through, I can try to comments here. The second dimension I call the involved interpersonal focus, which has of course this first person singular pronoun, so the involvement of the speaker or the speaker or writer there in the first person. Then we have second person pronouns, so it's not just me, it's me and you. And then we have, for example, the private verbs, which are these verbs of like the internal mental state, think, feel, and so on, which of course are this kind of this kind of personal involvement of the writer or the character being talked about in arts or literature, for example. And then these kind of interpersonal interactive features like WH questions, maybe discourse particles, for example. And of course, these are common in arts. Again, in plays and poems, that's mostly like lines of characters. So you have lots of first person and second person pronouns of the characters speaking to each other. And also the literature is a bit higher on this than the other genres, talking about the characters' lines, but then it also has much more this kind of depth involved in the personal, more descriptions of things going on. Then the third dimension I call the static statement. So this has the be as main verb as the most important feature. And many of these other features are then related to this be as being the main verb. So there is there, existential there, so you need a be. There is, of course, predicative adjective, so something is some adjective. The pronoun it, so it is, for example. Then many others like demonstrative pronouns, indicative pronouns. So this is clearly about, describing or talking about not actions, but, the state of being. So what is, for example. And that seems to be a bit more common maybe in the arts category, arts genre, and law genre, and then less in literature, where, people are talking about the actions, of course, the characters are doing and what is happening. In dimension 4, for the expression of options and possibilities, we have these modals at the top, possibility models like can, necessity models like must, predictive models like will, and then split auxiliaries. Of course, we need to have these auxiliaries like these modals to be able to make them. Then present tense, so you're talking about, what can and may and will happen if you're using the present tense. So all of this makes sense. And then not, you can say you cannot do something, and then if unless you can kind of hedge that or modify that if then something, and so on. And here we can see also some interesting things. So politics, for example, has this we can, we must, we will, or we cannot, we must not, we will not do something. And then less so in literature and in history, for example. So you're not talking about what people can, must, and will, should do in history, but we're talking about more actual things, I would hope. Then the fifth dimension I've got the complex reference. So here we have these very kind of more complex features, more complex clauses being embedded in these structures, like the W relative clauses on object and subject positions, and that's relative clauses on object positions, and then these piping relative clauses like the manner in which something and also that adjective complement. I'm happy that. And these are, of course, these more complex kind of structures, embedding more information into the sentence. And again, art, so not so much of that in the plays and poems, but more in the other categories, and especially, I think, philosophy and politics come maybe on the top. So these kinds of complex ideas, expression of complex ideas, of course, actually happens in those genres. And 6 is evaluation and qualification of information. We have these features like empathic, hedges, amplifies, learn toners, which are these words used to, well, emphasize, amplify, hedge, or tone down the content of what you're trying to say. And then also adverbs is, of course, also a way of evaluating or adding some information to what you're saying. And interestingly, of course, that is high in scientific improvement, so science and technologies, where these kinds of features tend to be present more. And then maybe at least of all in arts or literature. Less of that. There in literature, you tend to say what the characters do, and you say like, oh, maybe they did this or maybe they did. And then finally, we have this dimension, I call it third person focus, which is, well, the third person personal pronouns, of course, is the top one here. So you're talking about someone else, some other people. And history seems to be high here. So, you're talking about historical characters, what they did. And politics also, we're probably talking about other people and what they have done wrong. And then some of the other features, we have these like public verbs, so say, declare, and suasive verbs, which are like verbs with the intention of bringing about some change in the future, like agree or those kinds of things. So clearly talking about some other person doing something. But yeah, that was the MBA analysis of the OCR data. But now if we compare that to the TCP data, what happens? So what I did is I ran the exact same analysis of the exact same parameters, the exact same pipeline, but only changed the data to the OCR version of the data. Sorry, from the OCR to the TCP, the clean version of the data. And then I compared the dimensions which came out. And here on red, with red, we have the OCR data, and in blue, we have the TCP data. And these are the same dimensions that I just showed you. And as you can see, they are actually quite close to each other. There is not that much difference between them. I don't think so. Of course, there's some differences. They are not exactly the same. And in some cases, I would say when you look at the genres, for example, the TCP data makes more sense, but in some cases, maybe the OCR data is a bit closer to what you'd expect. So it's I would say that it's actually pretty close. So if you're looking at one or the other, you might get pretty much the same idea of what is going on here. So there is not much difference between them. And even the fact that we can simply map from these dimensions from the one analysis to the other. So the dimensions are close enough in the sets of features which are included in them that I can tell quite easily actually which dimension corresponds to which dimension on these two analyses. And actually the ordering of the dimensions was almost exactly the same. I just had to flip, I think, 2 pairs of these the other way around from TCP analysis to be able to directly have them together here. But I was actually astonished how well these 2 results matched. And just to show you one example of the first dimension here are the features we had on the left. We had for the OCR dimension, and then the feature for the TCP dimension. We can see that they are, well, pretty much exactly the same, except that there are these 3 features from the negative pole of the OCR dimension, which are missing from the TCP dimension. And then there are these 3 features on the TCP dimension, which were not present on the OCR dimension. But other than that, the main picture of the set of features, I think, still is largely the same. And of course, nouns, for example, is one of the features which is missing from the OCR dimensions entirely because nouns tends to be for the cut of speech circuit, that's kind of garbage class where, you know, if I don't know what this is, then it is a noun kind of thing. And that, of course, then kind of dilutes the analysis in terms of nouns. But here we have the nouns added there, for example, that other than that, you know, they're pretty much the same. And here we can also see the figures for the three dimensions, and they are, you know, the relative positions of all of the genres are pretty much the same. So for this proof of concept, it seems that the features which are associated with the dimensions do form these interpretable patterns, even on this OCR data, and those are meaningfully correlated with the genres, and both analysis, the OCR analysis and the TCP analysis, captures the phenomena. So in the future, going forward, I'm interested in analyzing the effects of the OCR quality on these individual registered features. That is something I've already started on a bit. And also applying the MBA to the full ECCO OCR dataset and seeing what happens with that. So something I've started a little bit and want to continue going on in the future. But then in terms of content, we want to, of course, compare different kinds of writing, which is what we do, right? And see how certain genres of writing change over time in terms of their register, which functions may be spread and which recede, and then seeing if we can track the spread of these things through these 18th century publishing networks we are interested in. So is there some kind of influence of the network structure there? One potential question that our historian colleagues are interested in could be, for example, the idea in history writing that history writing over the 18th century becomes less narrative and more dispassionate, more impersonal, and changes from this kind of narrative form to a more kind of description of system or process form. And I think this is exactly the kind of thing that could be true by register analysis. And here are my preferences, and I think then I will give the floor to Tanja for some conclusions.
Yeah, so that was just two examples of what we've been doing. So here are just briefly some other cases that we could also discuss. Maybe starting from the bottom. So this was with the metadata only. So this was the historians looking at the early modern canon from what we can glean just from the English short title catalogue in terms of large scale patterns of cultural production. And then we've already done a kind of a pilot study of distinguishing discourses. So looking at works and publishing networks of the Scottish Enlightenment. So kind of, I think here we tried to identify works that would be similar to one famous work by Hume. And then we looked at how these works were distributed through the publishing networks. It was kind of interesting, but it was very small scale and initial. And then this is a big win for the historians. So they have now produced this in the historical journal, which is apparently a very famous journal on that side and a very traditional one as well. So now we are getting digital history into that. And they've been looking at the dynamics of the Scottish Enlightenment, 18th century publisher networks and their evolution over time. And this is now something to which we linguists can then build onto. So now that we have these networks, what can we do? Can we look at language change? And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then we've got one more thing that might be of interest to the audience here. So we've also been looking at the dimensions of incoming economic vocabulary in 18th century Britain. So this is lexical multidimensional analysis. I think we weren't even aware that you guys have been doing this as well. So our approach is kind of similar, but also kind of different. Right. So future work, indeed, we will want to combine sociolinguistic analysis with these publishing networks. So thinking about the publishing networks of like who work together on the same editions and then on different ones as well, and what kind of network does that form in terms of the authors and the printers and the publishers, which we can get from ESTC, and looking at them as social networks in which changes, linguistic changes as well, propagate. We'll want to analyze incoming linguistic features, including lexical features, maybe also register would be interesting. And then we're thinking about some grammatical ones, which we know that kind of are changing in the 18th century, like maybe the progressive ing suffix, stuff like that. And we want to identify innovative individuals, which are not necessarily just authors, but could also be printers and publishers, somebody who like facilitated the spread of change maybe. And there are, of course, hypotheses coming from sociolinguistics as to like what kind of people in the social networks are the most innovative. So they're supposed to be like these second order network members who have lots of weak social ties. And then we've got, on the other hand, the central network members who are responsible for the propagation of the change. So we'll want to kind of try to look at some of that. And yeah, and then the specific cases we've done some work on the Scottish side of things, but then we also would like to look at French translations. Is there something that kind of comes from those and spreads throughout the publishing scene? And then also transatlantic influences, so what's happening between Britain and the US. Yeah, and maybe Aatu, you will say something to conclude about the register analysis.
Yeah, so I would also be interested in still further improving and then applying the register analysis on these things and these questions. So I would like to do further analysis on the applicability of the NDA and this OCR data, so what can and what can't be done. Looking at individual features, like I mentioned, how those are affected by this dirty OCR, and what kinds of features might then be better features to include in the kind of analysis. Maybe we can find some other features which would be better. And then also, if there is a way to reduce the effects of the OCR when you know that there is this kind of correlation with the OCR, maybe we can do something even statistically about that. I've been thinking about that. And then also, of course, my personal goal would be that we could then also use these tools for MBA and other kinds of dirty data, and well, methods to that MBA, other kinds of dirty data, like maybe, for example, social media data, which can be very noisy often. And then, of course, content-wise, I'm interested in functional changes in the genres during the 18th century, like I mentioned, the history rights cases as an example, and then seeing if there indeed is, and if we can track these effects of these publishing networks of the authors and publishers and such on these changes of registering history rights. So I guess that is it for us. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Started slightly late, so I'll start off by clearing room and saying if anybody needs to leave now is the time. But we do have a few more minutes for any of you who'd like to ask questions, and there may or may not be questions on my panel.
Just because they in, but
Okay, great. In that case, any questions, Battler?
Well, extremely fascinating on both counts, and so much potential in the data and further development. I have a specific question related to the Hume's list of words, because it appears to be a mixed bag in terms of why Hume would object to these as being Scotticisms. And I like David Hume as a philosopher. I have some doubts about David Hume as a linguist. He didn't have that
as a person.
type of training.
It's fashion as well.
As clearly demonstrated with the images. I was wondering whether there would be another dimension for the sort of future research that would look at the types of lexical items on the list, and why they were placed there, the sort of symmetry or asymmetry, because I'm thinking about the sort of underlying construct of normalizations or rationalization of language, and obviously the variable of the English versus Scottish split. So for instance, whether applying a mixed effect model with the items being a random variable in that would sort of give you some sense of whether there's some kind of variation coming from the individual items, as well as those sort of larger variables, as you sort of demonstrated, where the authors were born in types of genres and registers and so on and so forth. So just thinking aloud about that, whether this would at all be something
Yeah, that's a
worth
really good
pursuing.
idea taking, because they are very different, and we took a very simplistic kind of way here of just looking at the overall frequency, but then zooming in other ways, but sort of incorporating that in the analysis. Or do you remember, Aatu, if Eero has already tried this even?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, but
No,
probably
maybe.
not because it's not a mixed effects model. But yeah, really good idea. And there has been some research into like what kinds of things are these. And for example, Marina Dossena has written a whole book about Scotticisms, and she looks into Hume's list and kind of classifies the items. And I think we are kind of going to be continuing with this topic. And we've got Lydia, who's also been interested in kind of looking into what are these and how can we characterize them and maybe study them further. So that's a really good point. We'll keep that in mind. Maybe a mixed effects model, incorporating the individual items.
A question about the one publisher that you found who was strongly associated. There weren't an Edinburgh publisher by any chance.
I'm not sure at all. I haven't looked into this, but I mean, probably like Mikko would be able to say off the top of his head who the guy was. But yeah,
I guess that would be one of the more
if somebody
obvious
wants to
things.
quickly Google them, where did we find? Is it in the
More generally, I wondered if place of publication was important.
Sorry.
Place of publication.
Yeah, definitely. And we tried kind of experimenting a bit with looking into like inside Scotland, like is it Edinburgh or is it more peripheral places? I think we might have had too little data for that, sort of kind of not being able to say anything for sure, but that's definitely one aspect of it. So
If it's Robert Lee, which would fit with him being a publisher in 18th century, then it's Mansfield, Nottinghamshire, and Durham. So would be firmly on the English side as far as my 10 seconds of reading.
yeah, but it might be that he worked with the Scottish Enlightenment guys, who obviously they had lots of ties to London as well.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Amy from history, and I'm looking at physical history of the late 18th century particularly. So I spend a lot of time in tax records and legislation, but also other documents. So I was then thinking about the impact of standardization following Act of Union, the British states' attempts to get to grips with standardizing policy and practice in Scotland in particular, although actually for much of it they decided to just leave it and not bother. So then thinking about, is there a corpus of material on the regulatory side of the operations of the state, particularly around collection of tax, trading relations, thinking of your work, David Hume, in looking at smuggling, traders' records, things like that. That might be an interesting data set, but also thinking about published newspapers, particularly Scots newspapers. I don't know whether there's an adequate data set to do the kind of analysis you're doing, but having recently read a Scottish newspaper from 1780, I thought it might be interesting.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to look into newspapers as well. And also the side of like, how much of this, is there any pressure coming from the English side? Or is it more, I think like linguists have more thought about it in terms of the Scots being insecure about their own language and kind of trying to improve their social position by modifying it to sound as English as they can and so on. But it is interesting. Of course, there are these like there are probably like measures and stuff like that that would have been standardized and that would have shown up in the vocabulary as well. I don't think Hume had any on his list. That kind of thing. Yeah, that's really interesting.
My question links to Tony, and I noticed that you mentioned author, publisher, and printer. And I'm wondering over the course of the 17th century if there were changes in editorial practices. So these aren't changes in what authors are doing, but they are in effect another control point being put in on the language and whether that's traceable.
Yeah, that's a really good point that we kind of, it's hard to tell for sure. I mean, I've talked to people who are like very convinced that they wouldn't have taken the time. They might have changed some spellings, but nothing else. But then, I mean, there might be some editors who were a lot more kind of into it. And it might even, yeah, I think one way to approach this would be to look at the subsequent editions of the same work and see if there is like standardization within that, and do like more sort of, not this massive scale study, but looking at the individual works and how does it change by edition. And then well, it could be the author themselves kind of editing, like we know that Hume continued to kind of edit his own works throughout his life, apparently. And then, of course, I mean, there's some correspondence evidence, and we know that they were corresponding with the editors, and there were proofs, and they were complaining that stuff had been changed. I think we got a corpus of early English correspondence in Helsinki, where I don't think we have Scottish people, but there's some similar stuff going on the English side as well. Yeah, so that's a very good question. It's kind of, yeah. It would be, of course, really interesting to know to what extent there is editorial interference, and also like in terms of the social network analysis. So is it really, are they actually doing something to the language, or is it just that they are facilitating change by favoring certain types of publishers and works, and or certain types of authors and works? So yeah.
It would also link to the commercialization interest, the commercialization of the publication industry.
Yeah, exactly.
I had a question about the OCR. And how bad is it? How do I guess? And what do you have kind of similar errors to this consistent errors? What kinds of errors are in there? And how easy is it, would you say, to kind of clean it up?
It can be very good in some cases, and it can be very bad in some cases. So it really ranges the whole range of goodness of OCR quality. So some of the texts are you can't even tell it's a text if you give the data, and it's just random characters, and the best are really good. So
I think Hill and Henschen might have had some statistics
so
about like what is the average rate, but I don't remember now.
Hill and Henschen would be the place to look at. I think the results was that it was kind of on average like clear quality, so it's not like the average text isn't completely unreadable. Okay. And
the usability kind of really depends on what you want to look at.
Exactly. So
and there might be different solutions for different cases, but go on.
yeah, definitely. So that is a good point. So like here, I think what makes it work for my analysis is that I'm looking at these large scale aggregate measures. So even if you don't find all of the instances or even most of the instances of some feature, you still expect to find the correlations because the things still happen at the same places. So in that way, this is, I think, also further validation for the MDA method as well. But if you're interested in the individual instances of the context in which they appear, you have more problems with that, I guess. And as for cleaning it up, well, some of the texts are so bad that you can't even say it's a text, really, and it's impossible to clean those. But of course, cleaning it up has been, I guess, many years, it's a decade-long thing for the historians in our group also, and for other people to see like how can we deal with this data. So is it possible to just use it like this, or can we do some things to clean it up using, rules-based methods, like for example, and then some machine learning methods maybe. And I think well, it depends on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think one of the dreams is also to re-OCR the data, because I think we have the scans in Helsinki as well, so we would be able to do that. Of course, some of them are really bad quality. So
yeah, because the OCR has obviously, they have used some modern OCR software which has not been fine-tuned for historical data, 18th century typefaces. They don't understand long S, for example, at all. And the scans are also not that good of quality. They like bitonal, like black and white, not even grayscale, but actual black and white scans. So there is a lot that could be done on the kind of streaming side of things to make this better. But of course, people want to work with actual questions having to do with history, linguistics, and also there is an easier.
Look, as I guess, so you get a couple of examples of where your comparison might alert you to features that would be particularly affected by the OCR. So in the comparisons that you had, you said some were appearing in the same dimension. Would that help to highlight if you're going to do this? These are the ones that you have to keep an eye on, or I think you mentioned nouns, for example, they become kind of been.
Yeah, noun is one, and what I've been doing, and I don't have the data here, but I've been working a bit on looking into these individual features and how the OCR is affecting them. What I'm doing there is simply for now, I'm just mapping the frequency of the observed frequency change from the TCP to the OCR map to the quality of the text. And well, nouns is one that really increases with as the OCR gets worse, you get more nouns, which is great. But then other things are affected differently. But there are definitely ways to look into that.
Yeah, there seem to be like interesting different categories of things, where some are really affected by OCR quality really quickly, so you don't find them anymore. Whereas others are like there's a lower curve. But, yeah.
Just check if there's anything online.
Online, at the minute, we only have thanks and compliments.
Good.
Hello, online.
No.
Okay, maybe I'll finish off just with a comment on OCR based on the work we did looking at the 19th century newspapers, which aren't this data set, but exhibit the same problem, percent of OCR. One thing we found with that, of course, is that the OCR is random relatively, and consequently they generate a lot of habits. If you look into the forms that are generated by the OCRs, they tend to be unique. They're not repeated. So certainly for the purpose of our analysis, what we were trying to do, which was collocation with the data, if we use the frequency cutoff, that actually improved the quality of the signal hugely, because most of the errors were actually unique. They were sort of down in the distribution. Now, in your case, of course, many of the hapacs will also be open class items, which is why you're picking up these nouns and it's going into the bin because they say, I've never seen this before, it's emotional activity now in there. So I wonder whether you should run an experiment where you just use a frequency cutoff and say, we're not really interesting ourselves in things with frequency less than 3 or something like that. Yeah. And see whether that improves things slightly. Now, of course, that will depress the count of nouns because some of your real nouns will be down. But at the same time, it might actually just mask out most of the bad signal.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Definitely, I think that it might very well work, especially now that we have this data that even if you don't find everything, that's okay. So cutting out some of the things that would be.
With that said, what you've shown though, once again, like as we say in the book, the signal coming off register is so strong you can take a lot of degrading and you still see it. And that's a beautiful demonstration. You're going to publish this?
Yes, this is a forthcoming paper actually. It's already accepted for publication. Yes, Impress indeed. So it is in what was it again? Because it is proceedings of the
digital humanities in the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Yes, yes, they've changed the publication venue for that, so I don't remember what it is anymore. But
it's a university in Norway.
Okay,
yeah.
It will be.
But you will find it on our blog as soon as it comes. So that's one.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Questions